Beneath the quiet ground we cross every day, entire hidden worlds unfold. Colossal chambers carved as if by unseen hands, tunnels spiraling into darkness with neither clear beginning nor end, and subterranean structures so precise they seem to exceed the tools and intentions of their eras. Some were sealed, some abandoned, some forgotten entirely. Yet their walls still murmur design, purpose, and secrecy. They force a question older than history, but impossible to ignore. Why did ancient builders carve downward instead of upward? Why do so many of these places display planning without explanation, engineering without context, and secrets without answers? Whatever their creators intended, it is clear they built with intent. And equally clear they meant much of that intent to remain hidden. Beneath the softened contours of southern Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine reaches into the earth like an inverted cathedral grown over centuries. What began as a medieval search for brine slowly became a world shaped by geology and persistence, where the air thickens with the mineral scent of ancient seas trapped in stone. Corridors worn smooth by generations lead into deeper levels where the boundaries between extraction and artistry blur. Early shafts carry the marks of pure necessity. Timber supports whitened and blackened by salt. Narrow staircases cut with functional restraint, mining implements abandoned where they last served. But deeper chambers expand into symmetrical voids held up by pillars too refined for their brutal context, suggesting that even amid danger, collapse, and toxic air, the miners felt compelled to inscribe traces of themselves into the darkness. In St. Kinga's chapel altars reliefs, even chandeliers emerge from salt as though the mineral had been persuaded into devotion. Here the narrative shifts. The mine becomes a place where geological wonder and sacred intention converge. That such fragile beauty survives in such an unforgiving environment raises questions about how faith and craftsmanship endured in a realm defined by risk. Surrounding tunnels stretch outward like the spokes of a submerged wheel, tool marks repeating with hypnotic rhythm until they break into erratic scars where the salt's internal structure changed, forcing miners to improvise. Pools of brackish water reflect ceilings so perfectly that up and down become uncertain, and the mirrored depths evoke chambers yet unknown, lying behind collapses or natural barriers. Legends of deeper labyrinths persist at the edges of documented engineering. Sealed shafts appear in places long before official records mention them. Stairways descend to truncated levels with no clear function. In isolated pockets, sound behaves strangely, muffled in one corner, magnified in another, suggesting geometry of these spaces shapes acoustics in ways not yet fully understood. Geological surveys trace slow crystallization processes interrupted by subtle tectonic flickers, hinting that ancient hollows formed long before humans touched them. These natural voids, when found and expanded by miners, sometimes align in patterns that look deliberate without corresponding to known extraction paths, blurring the line between discovery and design. Most explanations remain grounded in mining history, yet the coexistence of sacred art, precision engineering, and odd anomalies leave space for imagination. The mine feels both carved and revealed, as if human hands met the earth halfway. And when the path finally rises back toward daylight, the transition from mineral silence to open air carries a lingering recognition. Some places resist complete interpretation, preserving echoes of geological ages and human endeavors in equal measure. Even mapped and measured, Wieliczka holds a story that lies just beyond certainty. Beneath the modest streets of Paula in Malta, the hypogeum of House of Flini descends through layers of limestone in a series of chambers whose shifting light curvature and stillness evoke both practicality and ceremony. The upper level holds rough cavities carved like early sheltering spaces. But as one moves downward, the rooms grow more refined, walls bending into smooth arcs, niches shaped to catch shadow, floors contour to guide movement. Excavators expecting a simple burial complex instead uncovered a multi-tiered architecture shaped by principles neither random nor purely functional. Entrances channel light in deliberate ways. Ceilings bear faint red ochre designs that echo motifs from Malta's temples above ground, and the atmosphere feels curated rather than incidental. Deeper chambers reveal features that complicate interpretation. In the so-called oracle chamber, spoken tones vibrate unnaturally, lingering in the air with a resonance not easily explained by its geometry. Modern tests confirm the effect, but its purpose, intentional design or discovered phenomenon, remains debated. Nearby, the decorated room shows craftsmanship far exceeding utilitarian need. Its surface is carved into rhythmic indentations reminiscent of temple architecture above the surface. Yet here, the design is intimate, almost introspective, as though crafted for gatherings whose meanings have disappeared. No tools or inscriptions survive to clarify the methods or rituals, leaving archaeologists to piece together meaning from scattered bones, pigment traces, and small beads of shell and stone. Contradictions accumulate. The layout seems too intricate for a necropolis alone, with passages arranged to control access and expansions carried out across phases that suggest evolving priorities. The site appears to have served as both burial ground and ceremonial center, adapted by generations who returned to a place already saturated with significance. The small figurines discovered within, most famously the reclining sleeping lady, hint at a symbolic world that likely involved dreams, death, regeneration, or ancestral veneration, but her exact role remains unclear. Stratigraphy reveals periods of heavy use alternating with abandonment, raising questions about shifts in ritual practice or population movement. Geology adds another dimension. The limestone varies in density and fossil content, perhaps guiding where rooms could be carved or influencing acoustic properties. Erosion, collapse, and earlier coring obscure the earliest phases, leaving unanswered whether some cavities were natural formations adapted by human hands. Walking through the hypogeum feels like moving through layers of meaning that once fit together but now survive only as fragments. Its architecture suggests intentional darkness and light, controlled sound, and symbolic movement, an underground world shaped by beliefs we can sense but cannot fully reconstruct. In its quiet chambers, where the air feels heavy with millennia of stillness, the site offers neither clear narrative nor final answer. It stands instead as a reminder that some ancient spaces were meant to guide experience rather than reveal purpose, and that their deepest intentions remain waiting in the shadows carved beneath the earth. And in certain corners of the hypogeum, the limestone reveals natural fissures that appear to have guided the earliest expansions, as if the builders were responding to cracks or cavities already present in the bedrock, features now obscured by centuries of modification. These subtle clues suggest that the structure was not the result of a single grand vision, but a long dialogue with the underground landscape, evolving as the community's relationship to the earth shifted, deepened, or drifted toward new meanings. Yet the lack of definitive evidence keeps multiple interpretations alive. That some chambers were crafted for acoustic rites involving chanting or percussion, that the twisting lower corridors were meant to restrict entry to those versed in specific cosmologies, that the turns and narrowing passages were designed to disorient, soften light, or prepare individuals for encounters with spaces seen as thresholds between worlds. Theories remain cautious, but the sensory character of the site makes them difficult to dismiss. Considering the full structure, its irregular but purposeful geometry, its interplay of rough and refined surfaces, its mixture of burial deposits and architectural sophistication, researchers often conclude that the hypogeum reflects a convergence of functions, a repository for ancestors, a locus of ritual, a symbolic descent into the island's geological memory. Each layer carries echoes of people whose intentions are glimpsed only through the material traces they left behind. Emerging once again into daylight, after navigating its downward spirals, the lingering impressions of shadow, resonance, and sculpted stone suggest that the site's greatest mystery is not hidden chambers, but the way its quiet design sustains an unresolved dialogue between human purpose and geological time, leaving one with the feeling that its origins remain just beneath the surface of understanding, waiting to be interpreted again. Hidden beneath the rolling landscape of Zhejiang, the Longyou Caves open into vast chambers whose scale and precision feel unexpectedly deliberate. The descent begins in silence, and the first impression is one of monumental emptiness. Vertical walls rising in smooth plains, covered in parallel chisel marks so rhythmic and consistent, they seem like a single continuous gesture frozen across stone. As the eyes adjust, the dimensions come into focus. Aisles soaring as high as multi-story buildings, pillars placed with calculated spacing, ceilings shaped into angled planes and sweeping arcs that imply an underlying logic but resist simple classification. No tools, debris, or inscriptions have ever been found within the caves. Though their creation is generally attributed to the late Warring States or early Han periods, the absence of datable materials leaves room for uncertainty. They show neither the straightforward scars of quarrying nor the iconography of ritual spaces. instead presenting hybrid interiors whose purpose must be inferred from form alone. Many chambers mirror each other in scale, but differ subtly in geometry, suggesting that multiple teams work from a shared conceptual plan while adapting to the stone's changing texture, moisture, or structural needs. Geological studies confirm that the region's soft sandstone is suitable for large excavation, yet the cave's stability over 2,000 years indicates a sophisticated understanding of load distribution. Their pillars, ceiling angles, and wall thicknesses create a structural harmony that seems too refined to be accidental. The repeated herringbone chisel patterns are usually attributed to quarrying methods, yet their aesthetic regularity has prompted speculation that they may also have served a symbolic or functional role, enhancing acoustics, aiding drainage, or diffusing light. However, these theories fail to explain the small but varied deviations in angle and depth observed across different chambers, variations that imply responsiveness to conditions rather than strict adherence to a formula. Small ledges, recesses, and platforms appear at irregular intervals, their purpose uncertain. They could be incomplete features, adaptations to natural inclusions, or remnants of structures now vanished, perhaps wooden walkways or water management devices. But the absence of tool scars or fastening points leaves such ideas unresolved. In one cave, still pools of water reflect the ceiling with such clarity that the space appears doubled, as though an inverted world lies beneath the surface. The hydrological stability of these pools suggests a careful reading of groundwater behavior, unusual for purely utilitarian quarrying. Local legends attribute the caves to supernatural beings or forgotten dynastic projects. While such tales preserve cultural memory, they offer no stratigraphic anchors. Some researchers even propose that the caves were deliberately cleaned of debris before abandonment, implying an organized inclusion rather than a sudden halt. Comparisons with known architecture from the surrounding region deepen the contradictions. While ancient China produced monumental earthen structures and large tomb complexes, few precedents exist for excavations of this magnitude. If the caves were quarries, the absence of corresponding monumental stone structures nearby is puzzling, and interior planning contradicts typical quarry logic, which prioritizes efficiency over symmetry. To address these gaps, scholars return to the cave themselves, tracing faint disruptions in wall patterns, slight discolorations, and changes in ceiling thickness that hint at natural fissures or earlier collapses stabilized by human intervention. These clues reveal a dynamic interplay between excavation and geology. Yet even this does not explain why such monumental effort was invested in these vast interiors. The caves remain suspended between practicality and abstraction, their emptiness refusing definitive interpretation. In the end, the Longyou Caves reveal no inscriptions, no narrative carvings, no clear hierarchy of spaces, only a rhythmic texture of chisels, an arrangement of pillars holding their silent weight, and a persistent impression that the builders aim for something beyond extraction or shelter. Their meaning now resides in the quiet geometry of their stone, inviting curiosity while refusing to yield a final explanation. Carved into the volcanic basalt cliffs of Maharashtra, the Ellora Caves extend along a rugged escarpment where devotion, political ambition, and the stubborn materiality of stone merge into a single architectural continuum. The progression begins with modest Buddhist viharas, rows of cells and pillar halls carved with measured restraint, and gradually expands into grander compositions where stone responds to shifting intentions. As Hindu and Jain patrons join the tradition, the rock face transformed into a tapestry of forms. Freestanding pillars emerging from the cliff itself, ceilings alive with sculpted narratives, and walls dense with mythic figures woven so seamlessly into the rock that geology and artistry become indistinguishable. The overall layout appears linear at first, but subtle deviations, changes in orientation, alterations in depth, shifts in carving methods, reveal a far more layered story. Different religious communities work simultaneously or in overlapping phases, reusing some spaces, abandoning others, and pushing the rock into new shapes as political and cultural climates shifted. The result is an architectural palimpsest in which Buddhist austerity, Hindu exuberance, and Jain refinement coexist, not as competing statements, but as variations within a shared landscape. Each cave carries its own character. Some halls feel weightless despite their massive pillars. Others collapse perspective through dense sculptural programs that turn stone into narrative. Kailasa, the famed monolithic temple, stands as the most dramatic example, carved downward from the top of the cliff into a freestanding complex whose existence seems to defy the logic of excavation. Yet even the smaller caves hold quiet marvels, rhythmic freezes, unfinished experiments, acoustic peculiarities, and architectural transitions that show how artisans adapted their craft across centuries. The caves collectively embody a dialogue between religious expression and geological constraint. Their makers worked with the cliff's natural fractures, using them as guides or obstacles depending on the needs of the moment. Variations in basalt density dictated the fineness of carving. Shifts in political patronage dictated scale and ambition. At times, the work seems almost improvisational. At others, impossibly precise. Standing within these carved spaces, whether in a dim Buddhist hall, a soaring Hindu sanctuary, or a finely etched Jain chamber, one senses the centuries of accrued intention. Ellora is not a singular creation, but a layered story told through stone, a place where devotion, engineering, and imagination converge into forms that remain compelling even as their full contexts blur with time. Each chamber holds not only the marks of tools, but the echoes of beliefs, experiments, and ambitions that shaped one of the ancient world's most remarkable architectural landscapes. Spaces once shared by Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain artisans show traces of collaboration and adaptation, where practical coexistence mattered more than strict ideological boundaries. Inscriptions are sparse, intentions only partly legible in stone. And among all these excavations, the Kailasa Temple remains the most astonishing anomaly, a monument carved downward from a single mass of basalt, transforming negative space into architecture with such precision that the void itself becomes sculpture. Its vast courtyard, encircling galleries, and towering central shrine required not only vision, but an intricate understanding of load, drainage, sequencing, and the choreography of removing tens of thousands of tons of rock without compromising the final form. Yet contradictions surface upon close inspection. Tool marks, irregular depths, and unfinished recesses in peripheral corridors reveal a more complex reality. Multiple teams working simultaneously, adapting to fissures, correcting collapses, and modifying plans as unexpected geological features emerged. The reliefs that appear so meticulously composed tell a similar story. Figures subtly reworked, compositions shifted mid-execution, niches abandoned or repurposed, all hinting at evolving ritual priorities or pragmatic adjustments to the stubborn material. In neighboring caves, the stone's natural fractures dictated pillar placement and chamber sequencing, producing subtle deviations that challenge any assumption of a rigid architectural blueprint. Geology played an equally decisive role. Basalt flows of uneven hardness alternated through the cliff, forcing artisans to adjust depth, refine structural supports, or abandon ambitious designs. Where the rock proved brittle, pillars thickened, ceilings became more conservative, and certain walls remained undecorated. These variations reveal an ongoing negotiation between artistic ambition and the constraints of living stone. Yet the symbolic programs layered onto these surfaces introduce their own uncertainties. The coexistence of Buddhist chicha halls, Hindu shrines, and Jain monasteries evokes a vibrant social dynamic, perhaps collaboration, perhaps competition, perhaps a mixture of both. Without clear records, the motivations remain open to interpretation. Royal patronage encouraging plural expression, localized guild traditions evolving side by side, or communities working independently while sharing the same cliff. Some scholars imagine a period of deliberate religious harmony. Others see pragmatic coexistence, shaped by geology and patronage rather than ideology. Inscriptions link a few caves to specific rulers, but many of the most elaborate remain anonymous. Style and toolmark analyses suggest overlapping construction periods rather than a clean timeline. Unfinished caves complicate the narrative further. Were they halted by political turmoil, dwindling resources, shifts in patronage, or geological difficulties? In the Jain caves of the northern end, delicate ornamentation and slender pillars reveal a later phase of refinement, pushing volcanic basalt toward almost weightless forms. This contrast, from a monumental carving of Kailasa to the intricate filigree of Jain shrines, shows the elasticity of Ellora's architectural imagination. Walking the length of the complex reveals a shifting acoustical landscape. Chicha halls where even a soft footstep echoes like a drumbeat, enclosed chambers where sound dulls into silence, and open courtyards where wind filters through carved screens, producing a sense of space at once enclosed and boundless. Across the entire escarpment, the impression is of a centuries-long conversation between human intention and geological reality. Every carving decision carried consequences. Every natural fault demanded adaptation. The unity of Ellora lies not in a single purpose, but in the persistent human impulse to transform stone into memory, devotion, and craft. And yet much remains uncertain. The deeper motivations behind the sequence of caves, the lived experiences of their artisans, the nuances of patronage, and the ritual rhythms once enacted here, these remain only partially recoverable. Ellora ultimately stands between surface clarity and historical opacity, its colonnades and chambers offering a reminder that even thoroughly mapped sites can retain mysteries at their core, their deepest meanings residing in questions that cannot be fully resolved. Along the serpent-shaped bend of the Wagra River, the Longyou Caves unfurl in a soft arc of basalt where shifting monsoon light, echoes of monastic life, and centuries of artistic devotion converge. The earliest excavations form modest viharas, square halls lined with simple cells, ceilings marked by restrained toolwork, facades only lightly ornamented, suggesting communities seeking contemplative refuge rather than monumental display. But moving along the curve of the cliff, the caves grow in ambition. Later Mahayana phases introduce sweeping chaitya halls with vaulted ceilings carved to mimic wooden prototypes, their ribs catching light in gentle gradients that soften stone into something almost organic. Intricately sculpted facades unfold in rhythmic sequences. Guardians, musicians, celestial beings, echoing the flow of the river below. Inside, murals still vibrate with color despite centuries of soot, water, and touch. Their pigments, layered with astonishing subtlety, preserve courtly scenes, parables, and symbolic gestures rendered with such refined motion that they appear suspended in time. Uneven preservation, flaking surfaces, darkened patches, clumsy restorations, turns each painting into a layered conversation between ancient intention and the pressures of survival. Contradictions emerge in the site's organization. Though broadly chronological, a jhana is not a linear evolution, but an overlapping coexistence of Hinayana Chaityas and Mahayana Viharas. Older caves were maintained, repurposed, or elaborated even as new artistic and ritual programs developed. This complexity challenges earlier models of abrupt doctrinal shifts, instead suggesting dialogue between tradition and innovation. Inscriptions identify certain patrons, kings, merchants, local elites, but many of the grandest caves remain anonymous. Tool-mark patterns indicate multiple guilds working simultaneously, adjusting designs in response to basalt's fickle densities, hidden fissures, or pockets of crumbly stone that force redirection, reinforcement, or abandonment. Cave 19's ornate chaitya facade contrasts with simple interior, raising questions about public versus internal ritual functions. Cave 20's monumental reclining Buddha reveals a similarly layered creative process. Narrative reliefs guiding movement and focus, yet marked by reworked figures and shifts in composition. Evidence of adaptation rather than fixed planning. The murals themselves reveal underdrawings, corrections, and altered gestures, hinting at dynamic workshop practices. Their pigments came from local minerals, plant dyes, and rare imports, testifying to trade networks still incompletely understood. Environmental studies show that microclimates once stabilized by cliff overhangs have gradually changed due to vegetation loss, river shifts, and increased visitation. These shifts alter humidity and paint behavior, offering indirect clues about how ancient monks regulated airflow and lighting with lamps, screens, and reflectors now lost, preserved only as soot traces and faint ceiling discolorations. Hypotheses about solar alignment arise from the way certain entrances catch seasonal light, though geological constraints complicate interpretation. Some caves remain unfinished, columns half-carved, facades outlined but never completed. Such abrupt halts might reflect political instability, sudden loss of patronage, or geological challenges. Together, the Longyou Caves form another layered dialogue between belief geology, craftsmanship, and time. Their arc of chambers merges contemplation with spectacle, narrative with silence, precision with improvisation. And despite extensive scholarship, much about Longyou remains unresolved. not in the sense of hidden secrets, but in the recognition that the intentions, negotiations, and lived experiences shaping their creation now survive only in pigment traces, tool marks, and the shifting light that moves across their walls. They endure as a testament to ancient imagination, luminous, intricate, and just beyond complete understanding. In the absence of written explanations, Ajunta's final centuries remain open to multiple readings, its chambers functioning as silent records of intentions that never fully resolve. The continuity of monastic presence is clear, yet its gradual decline and long burial beneath vegetation add a final layer of uncertainty. When rediscovered in the 19th century, many entrances were concealed beneath soil and roots, as though time itself had attempted to draw the complex back into the cliff. This obscurity preserved several murals while erasing vital clues about the site's last phases of use. Walking the sequence today, one feels not only the mastery of its artisans, but the shifting intentions that shaped its evolution, from secluded monastic refuge to elaborately developed devotional landscape. Each chamber carries traces of belief, accommodation, and geological negotiation, yet none reveals how these elements intertwine with perfect clarity. Returning to the forested slope above, the impression remains that Ajunta's significance lies as much in its unresolved layers as in its celebrated artistry, a dialogue between aspiration and erosion, memory and silence, whose deepest motivations remain just beyond certainty. Beneath the plains of Cappadocia, Derinkuyu descends through volcanic tuff in a sequence of levels that blur the line between deliberate design and geological responsiveness. The upper layers contain wide chambers, storage rooms, and stable-like niches shaped with simple geometry, their ventilation shafts suggesting practical needs rather than monumental intent. Yet even here, small irregularities, unexpected alcoves, corridors narrowing without pattern, stairways bending at subtle angles, indicate adjustments to shifting stone density, as though construction evolved in direct response to the behavior of the rock. The deeper levels tighten into networks of passages arranged with a mixture of caution and intelligence. Ventilation shafts, descending through multiple stories, maintain airflow with surprising consistency, implying empirical knowledge passed through generations rather than formally codified engineering. Rolling stone doors appear as strategic bottlenecks, massive circular slabs meant to seal passages during threat. Yet their distribution is uneven. Some floors are heavily fortified, others open and undefended, suggesting shifting patterns of use, temporary refuge, seasonal occupation, or specialized activities whose functions have faded. Soot traces and shallow heart depressions hint at domestic activity in certain chambers, while adjacent spaces remain untouched, creating a mosaic of uses that defies classification as either permanent settlement or purely emergency shelter. The scarcity of organic remains obscure as population estimates and durations of habitation, leaving open the possibility of episodic occupation aligned with cycles of conflict or migration. Progressing downward, the architecture grows more intricate. Narrow corridors widen unexpectedly into meeting rooms, then fracture into staircases leading to wells, communal areas, and storage alcoves. Tool marks reveal overlapping phases of excavation, different strokes, angles, and rhythms suggesting multiple periods of work, perhaps even multiple communities. Geological variations in tough hardness dictated chamber placement. Softer layers invited expansion, while harder bands forced lateral detours or thicker supports, producing irregularities that, while practical, give the complex its labyrinthine feel. Comparisons with nearby underground cities reveal both shared strategies and notable divergences. Some complexes emphasize defense, others prioritize storage or religious space. Derinkuyu, in contrast, descends with unusual depth, about 18 stories, and its lowest levels contain rooms whose functions remain uncertain. Long corridors ending abruptly, compartments lacking ventilation, oddly shaped chambers with no clear domestic or industrial analogs. These features invite cautious interpretations involving storage, confinement, or ritual use, though none align neatly with available evidence. The ventilation system itself appears to have been extended in stages. Early shafts were modified as new floors emerged, requiring delicate adjustments to maintain airflow. Engineers left no markers explaining these decisions. Researchers infer them from soot distribution and sediment near abandoned openings. Water management deepens the mystery. Wells draw from aquifers feeding both surface and subterranean communities, yet the relationship between these channels remains unclear. How water was safeguarded from contamination during prolonged underground stays is still not fully understood. Derinkuyu scale has inspired theories ranging from simple refuge to prolonged habitation during sieges or climatic instability. But archaeological data is ambivalent. The infrastructure could support large populations, yet the absence of extensive refuse layers suggests intermittent rather than continuous occupation. Block corridors and collapsed segments hint at further extensions, possibly linking to neighboring underground settlements. Whether these were formal connections or geological coincidences remains unresolved. Emerging into daylight after traversing its lower levels, one feels the architectural logic of the complex less as a single plan than as a layered conversation between necessity, ingenuity, and the landscape itself. Its deepest meanings remain suspended in its branching corridors, traces of choices shaped by circumstances now obscured. Beneath Paris, the catacombs stretch through a network of limestone quarries whose origins long predate the city that grew above them. Beginning as medieval and early modern extraction fields that supplied stone for churches, bridges, and fortifications, the quarries form an unruly maze of pillars and chambers shaped more by geology than deliberate planning. Centuries later, collapsing ground and overcrowded cemeteries forced officials to reconsider these empty spaces, transforming them into repositories for millions of human remains. This conversion unfolded gradually. Engineers first mapped a labyrinth, confronting abandoned tunnels, unstable ceilings, and waterlogged chambers carved by miners who had followed the unpredictable contours of Lutean limestone. To stabilize the underground, workers added masonry walls, reinforced pillars, and inscriptions marking dates and supervisors. Yet large stretches remained untouched, their pick scars intact, their ceilings fractured by natural fissures or pockets of soft stone. The result is a juxtaposition between raw extraction and intentional engineering, layers of labor separated by centuries but coexisting in the same shadowed spaces. When the ossuary was formally established in the late 18th century, bones were transferred from overflowing parish cemeteries and arranged with stark deliberation. Skulls and femurs were stacked into geometric patterns, walls of bone set against structural masonry, while deeper piles filled cavities behind them. These arrangements carried both practical and symbolic weight. They stabilized the passages while imposing order on the remnants of countless lives, transforming the catacombs into a space where architecture, mortality, and civic necessity intersect. As more quarries were incorporated, new anomalies appeared. Stairways leading to voids, shafts opening into forgotten galleries, and flooded pockets where groundwater silently accumulates. Some corridors echo sharply, while others swallow sound, reflecting the uneven geometry inherited from mining. Occasional plaques commemorate quarrymen, engineers, or inspectors, standing beside tunnels that retain their rough medieval textures. Today, the catacombs feel neither wholly engineered nor wholly organic. They reveal a city's evolving relationship with its own depths, a place shaped by extraction, crisis, and ritualized remembrance. Walking through the dim passages, one senses how much remains unresolved. The extent of older networks' lost collapse, the undocumented labor that shaped the quarries, and the layers of Parisian history embedded in walls where stone and bone share space. The catacombs persist not as a singular monument, but as a vast palimpsest beneath the city, a quiet geometry of tunnels that preserves traces of practical need, geological change, and inexorable passage of time. Skulls and femurs form alternating courses, their pattern arrangements creating macabre facades that conceal loose, uneven piles behind them. Yet even these orderly displays contain inconsistencies, sections where bones are meticulously stacked beside areas where haste or limited manpower left the formations irregular. The result is a layered landscape in which order and disorder coexist, each corridor revealing small variations in technique and intention. In some passages, inscriptions offer fragments of reflection, dates, quotations, brief moral reminders, but their distribution is sporadic, leaving long stretches of silence where the tunnels bend, narrow, or drop unexpectedly, shaped by the original quarry geometry rather than any unified plan of commemoration. Deeper within, traces of earlier quarrymen remain, carved signatures from 18th century inspectors, Survey marks noting structural concerns, remnants of buttressing systems once meant to hold unstable ceilings in place. In damp chambers, natural seepage creates mineral blooms, thin curtains of calcite or crystalline nodules, that soften the line between human excavation and the slow geological forces still at work. Contradictions become clearer when comparing maps drafted across different eras, for the underground has been redrawn repeatedly as tunnels collapsed, were sealed, reopened, or diverted. The catacombs shift constantly in response to the pressures of the city above. New buildings, subway lines, sewer adjustments, and groundwater management all influence which sections must be reinforced and which must be abandoned. Much of the network visible in older surveys no longer exists in its original form, leaving modern researchers to reconstruct vanished connections from fragmentary diagrams. Beyond the curated ossuary, restricted stretches retain the raw character of quarries untouched by decorative intent. Here, pillars are irregular, floors uneven, and sudden drops open into dark pockets of the older grid. Unexpected features emerge in these zones. Benches carved into the rock, small alcoves shaped into makeshift chapels, and stone basins whose purpose remains uncertain, possibly resting places, protective rituals performed by miners, or later additions by clandestine visitors. Without contextual artifacts, their meanings remain suspended in speculation. Fossil-rich limestone surfaces appear in some chambers, revealing bedding plains formed in ancient seas. Miners follow the most workable strata, leaving behind jagged variations where harder layers forced abrupt deviations in direction, producing a labyrinth sculpted jointly by extraction and geology. Even the ossuary's apparent consistency masks historical variation. Over the centuries, bones were res-tacked, reorganized, and sometimes relocated entirely, resulting in subtle differences in arrangement patterns that reflect changing custodial priorities rather than a single coherent vision. These differences, nearly invisible without careful study, remind us that the catacombs are not a static monument, but an evolving archive shaped by repeated human intervention. The uneven degree of finish across the complex, ornamented galleries beside untouched quarry corridors, raises lingering questions. Why were certain passages chosen for embellishment while others remained raw? Were decisions guided by structural stability, symbolic purpose, or simply practical convenience? The answers remain elusive. Moving to the long corridors, where skulls stare outward from rigorously ordered rows and where silence gathers in the unlit recesses between pillars, one perceives not a tidy narrative but an accumulation of incomplete stories. Urban expansion, public health crises, shifting burial customs, and centuries of maintenance layered atop an ancient geological substrate. The catacombs hold choices made under pressures both remembered and forgotten, and emerging at last into daylight, the abrupt transition from subterranean irregularity to the structured clarity of the modern city makes the tension unmistakable. The human order imposed below remains fragile against the complexity of the limestone labyrinth that underlies Paris and continues, in quiet ways, to shape the city. Hidden beneath the Sierra Nevada foothills, moaning caverns descends through limestone formed from ancient marine sediments, its entrance narrowing before plunging into a soaring vertical chamber. The walls rise in fluid sweeps and sculpted hollows, shaped by millennia of water dissolving and retreating through the stone. Smooth whirls, faint ribs, and mineral veils record the motions of long-vanished currents, giving the cavern a sense of having been coaxed slowly into its present form. From first ascent, moisture and echo interact. Droplets fall from high shelves and strike stone in resonant tones that shift with humidity, temperature, and seasonal groundwater changes. Soundscapes early visitors liken to the earth breathing, a poetic impression that persists even as geology offers more grounded explanations. Deeper in the chamber, band of oxidized iron, manganese stains, and thin calcite layers reveal environmental fluctuations across thousands of years. These mineral sequences form a partial but broken archive of past climates, blurred by later deposition, and requiring careful sampling to interpret. Scattered among ledges lie ancient bone deposits, humans and animals intermingled. Some represent accidental falls through the narrow shaft. Others arrive by floodwaters or predators using the entrance as a natural drop. The mixture complicates efforts to determine intentional human presence. A notably intact human skeleton discovered in the early 20th century inspired stories of prehistoric ritual or sacrifice, but archaeological reading remains cautious. Without accompanying artifacts, an accidental fall is the simplest explanation given the shaft's treacherous geometry. The communities who shaped these subterranean spaces did so without leaving perfect narratives of their motivations. What survives instead are patterns. Clusters of rooms suggesting family units, interconnected passages implying communal cooperation, isolated niches hinting at private devotion or storage. But patterns do not reveal everything. Some rooms feel oddly disproportionate, too large for simple use, too small for large gatherings. Others contain low benches carved along the walls, yet lack soot or debris that might have confirmed domestic function. These ambiguities persist, resisting efforts to flatten the site into a singular explanation. They reflect a world where necessities shifted over centuries, where a chamber meant for storage in one generation could be reinterpreted as a shelter in the next or a devotional alcove in a later era of crisis. Even the act of descending into these complex networks becomes a lesson in how ancient communities perceived risk. Narrow choke points, angled doorways, and blind corners served as defensive features, intended to slow intruders' channel movement and provide strategic advantage for defenders. Yet these same features could also act as airflow regulators, acoustic buffers, and psychological transitions between communal and private spaces. Here, function is rarely singular. Each carved threshold may have held layered meanings depending on the circumstances of its use. The interplay between geology and social adaptation becomes even more evident in the ventilation shafts, vertical tubes that rise like the hollow cores of giant trees embedded in stone. Some shafts run uninterrupted from lower levels to surface, while others shift direction, merge with stairwells, or widen into bell-shaped chambers whose purpose remains unclear. In a few complexes, shafts intersect multiple domestic zones, hinting that airflow may have been carefully managed during extended stays underground. Yet geological studies propose that some shafts simply follow pre-existing fractures widened by hand rather than planned with precision. The truth likely lies somewhere between practical knowledge gained over generations, refined to necessity rather than theoretical engineering. What remains perhaps most compelling is the sense of incremental growth. Unlike monumental above-ground structures built in single campaigns, Cappadocia's labyrinths grew in pulses. Rooms carved in response to harsh winters, corridors extended during times of invasion, secondary chambers added as populations shifted. This piecemeal construction mirrors the fluidity of life in a region shaped by migration, conflict, and environmental stress. The architecture becomes a record of adaptation rather than ambition, and in this way, the subterranean world feels less like a city designed from above and more like a living system, continually revised in response to survival. Above ground, fairy chimneys and eroded cliffs often mirror the forms underground. Some scholars suggest that communities may have intentionally echoed the surface in their subterranean designs, reinforcing familiar spatial rhythms during periods of concealment. Others argue the resemblance is coincidental, shaped by the same geological forces that determine both the pinnacles above and the chambers below. Regardless, the visual dialogue between surface and depth creates a striking impression. Cappadocia is a landscape where architecture does not merely occupy space, it permeates it. Archaeological surveys have attempted to trace chronological phases across these labyrinths, identifying tool marks associated with different periods or stylistic preferences in niche shapes, hearth designs, and door construction. Yet such distinctions blur quickly. Later occupants repurposed earlier chambers, leaving overlays of soot, ash, pottery fragments, and tool abrasions that complicate stratigraphic clarity. In some complexes, Christian crosses appear scratched into older walls, indicating later religious use. In others, storage pits align more closely with medieval economic needs than with earlier survival strategies. These layers of reoccupation remind us that the labyrinths were not static relics, but evolving infrastructures, shaped by people responding to changing realities. Local folklore adds additional texture. Stories of entire villages disappearing into the earth during raids, of tunnels linking distant towns, of hidden chambers filled with relics or lost archives. While archaeology rarely confirms such accounts, folklore captures emotional truths. The labyrinths represented safety, secrecy, and continuity. They allowed communities to endure periods of disruption, preserving cultural memory through physical refuge. At the same time, the labyrinths reflect vulnerability. Many lower rooms lack ventilation sufficient for long-term habitation. Water sources vary dramatically in reliability. Storage capacities, while significant, could not sustain large populations indefinitely. This suggests that while underground life was possible, it was likely temporary, activated by necessity rather than sustained as a preferred mode of living. The complexity of the network speaks not only to ingenuity but to precarious conditions that demanded such spaces. Even today, efforts to map the full extent of Cappadocia's underground world face challenges. Collapsed corridors, sediment-filled shafts, and private properties restrict access. Modern construction occasionally reveals forgotten chambers, reminding us that the subterranean landscape remains partly unknown. Ground-penetrating radar offers hints of further voids, but geological interference and modern infrastructure complicate results. The possibility of undiscovered networks lingers, not in the romantic sense of hidden treasure, but in the quieter truth that landscapes shaped over millennia seldom reveal themselves entirely. Ultimately, Cappadocia's underground labyrinths endure as testaments not to mystery for its own sake, but to the human instinct for adaptation. Their winding corridors preserve a dialogue between survival and ingenuity, between fear and community, between stone that yields readily and stone that demands caution. As one stands at the threshold between light and descent, the impression is not a lost civilization, but of a living continuity, centuries of people shaping the earth as the earth shaped them. Their story remains suspended between fragmented evidence and the stubborn silence of volcanic rock, inviting interpretation while resisting finality, echoing across chambers carved by hands long vanished, yet still present in every curve of stone.